And good evening and welcome to Yemei Yun Betanach Tafshin Pei Gimel. This year you've had some excellent tours, bashetach, out there following the different footsteps of different stories, different battles, different travels in Tanakh, and there are going to be some excellent tours and programs in the rest of the evening. What I'd like to do with you in this presentation, in this sort of virtual tour, is to get a bird's eye view, an overview of the main highways in Tanakh, especially the ones that go through Israel, the international routes, as well as the more local routes. And this will help us open Tanakh in a different way. This will help us look at things differently. It'll help us understand that the geography and the topography really dictate the way certain stories unroll. So the first thing we have to think about in terms of travel routes is, why do people travel? And there's three main reasons for that. The first one is trade. Trade means that I want to ship commodities. It can be precious metals, stones, wood, or anything else that I produce from one place to another. And there's many different factors that need to be dealt with. There is, first of all, just safe transport, which can be safety from bandits. It needs to be smooth sailing. You want to also protect your merchandise to make sure that it doesn't get ruined. So it can be anything that approximates temperature control. In the old age, doesn't come close to what we do today. But nevertheless, you want to know that you're traveling in the right weather and the right conditions. Then, of course, there's maritime trade, and there is land trade. All of these travel routes, of course, have to be protected. You need to have soldiers with you. And of course, part of travel is lodging and security. So for example, when you dock in a port city, you want there to be fortresses to protect that port from invaders, which was very common in ancient times. You also want to make sure that you have where to eat, where to sleep, bed and breakfast, entertainment, food. So all of those different things contribute to the strategic locations of different cities. And if you want to summarize the main superpowers of the ancient world, the first cities, and why this area is called the cradle of civilizations, you have to look at the trade routes. And the main trade routes, of course, were on water. It's the fastest and easiest way to travel. So that takes us to Ur Kasdim. Ur Kasdim, where Avraham is born, is really the center of both maritime and land trade routes of the ancient world. We're going back more than 4,000, even 4,300 years ago. And Ur is at the center of all of these routes that trade in everything from gold and silver and precious metals to lapis lazuli and cedars of Lebanon and the spice route. All these things have to go through Ur. And of course, once they go through Ur takes a cut. And that's why all of these cities, these port cities, these cities that are at these junctions, are considered very wealthy cities. And the first empires in the world are called the river empires. Whether it's Egypt in the west of Israel, or it's in the east of Israel, northeast, you're talking about the Hittites, or Mitanni, or Assyria, or Babylon, or Persia. There are two other reasons that people would travel long distances. One of them is migration. One of them is scarcity. Scarcity of food, or perhaps famine, war, or other reasons, invaders. People would migrate, they would leave their hometown and they would go to other places. So a famous example of that would be the Plishtim, the Philistines, who basically migrated from the Aegean Sea looking for a better place, and they come and invade the coast of Israel. They try to invade Egypt as well. From the east, of course, we have several of the nations that are part of what's known as Eretz Canaan, Chiti, Amori, Perzi, Yebusi, Girgashi. Many of them migrated from different parts in the Middle East. Sometimes it's because of war, or scarcity, or famine. But the third, and perhaps the most important and prominent, and the reason for travel that perhaps had the most profound impact on our region, is war, battle. I want to fight somebody, I want to maintain control over an area, and you always have to consider what's the best way, the most optimal and safe and secure and fast and efficient way to travel. And that is dictated by the topography, by the geography, by the lay of the land. And that takes us from Mesopotamia into the land of Israel. When we're talking about Mesopotamia, and I'm also going to add to that the other part of the Fertile Crescent, I'm going to add Egypt, you're talking about staying close to the water. So if you're coming from Ur into Eretz Israel, you have to stay along the water, to stay close to civilization, close to supply lines. Last year's virtual tour was about Ever HaNahar, and we saw that it's considered to be a completely different world when you come from Haran and cross over the Prat, the Euphrates, into Eretz Canaan. So it's just a different world, the Ever HaNahar, the other side of the river. So why would we want to talk about Eretz Israel? That's because Eretz Israel, or Eretz Canaan, is at the crossroads. It's a bridge between the three main continents, which today we call Asia, Europe, and Africa. Because it is the crossroads and is relatively limited in terms of its resources, it was of less interest to the empires in the area to conquer Israel, but rather to control the passageway to other places. And if you control the passageway, you can secure your own interests of transporting goods or going through for battle if you need to. But Israel in itself was more of a bridge. And this is the way it was for Egypt, who passed through Israel many times and eventually conquered Canaan from the Canaanim, or whether it's Assyria or Babylon or even Persia. It's all about that passageway between these three continents. That takes us into the main highways in Israel. Now, when you want to travel in Israel, we're talking before GPS, before Waze, before all that stuff, before the internet. How do you know where to go? You open a map. Now, the map of Israel today divides the roads into north-south and to east-west. And if you're familiar, you know that north-south is usually even numbers and east-west is odd numbers. So for example, Derech HaHar, which we call Highway 60, Derech HaAvot, that's northwest, whereas Highway 1, or Ayalon, if you're going from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv, or what used to be Yafo, that's Highway 1 or 443. That's the odd numbers. Let's cover a few of the main north to south routes, and then we're going to talk about the east to west routes with a few examples for each one of how they fit, where they're used. So we're going to start off with King's Highway. Now, the King's Highway, of course, is not the King's Highway of New York. I'm talking about Derech HaMelech. Derech HaMelech shows up several times in Tanakh. The two most famous stories are the first battle mentioned in Tanakh, and that is in Bereshit Perek Yud Daled, where Avraham Avinu gets caught up in this war of these Axis kings of Mesopotamia who come to squash a local coalition, a rebellion against them, which of course has something to do with taxes. You know, you stop paying taxes, that'll always get the government to come for you. That story can best be understood if you're reading the pasuk and then you look at the map and you're following the King's Highway. They're coming from far away. They are waging battle. So that's south of the Dead Sea. Same area. So we're basically in the local area of Yam HaMelech. And they all gather at Emek HaSidim El Yam HaMelech. And our story of the kings who come in from Mesopotamia. How do you come in to get to the south of the Dead Sea? Well, obviously, on the King's Highway. Vayaku et Refaim be'Ashterot Karnaim, that's moving from north, and we're moving south. Ashterot Karnaim shows up later in the battles of Sichon and Og, so that's in the north. Ve'et Azuzim beham, ve'et Ha'imim b'Shaveh Kiryatayim, ve'et Hachori beHareram Seir, ad El Paran asher al Midbar. So we've basically moved from north to the south of the King's Highway, and then we're going to cross over westward, crossing the Jordan, going into Eretz Israel, and then basically continuing going up north. And this is where Avraham Avinu jumps in to the battle. Avraham is in Elonei Mamre when he hears about Lot being captured, and he pursues with a bunch of people. So he's going north all the way to Dan, the northern border of Israel. So he continues up until Chova, which is north of Damascus. So that's that story. Then Avraham comes back, and he's back locally. There's Yerushalayim, Melech Shalem, there's Sodom. So that's pretty much the story. Another place the story comes up, of course, is when we leave Mitzrayim and we're on our way to come into Eretz Israel. Now, we're going to talk about the main route that we didn't take leaving Egypt. That's called Derech Hayam, or Derech Eretz Plishtim. But we went through the desert and came in from the south and then up from the east. And here is where we want to just pass through Edom, more or less along King's Highway. Moshe Rabbeinu sends messengers from Kadesh to Melech Edom, telling him the whole story, and he finally says, Na'abrana be'artzecha, let us just pass through your land. Lo na'avor b'sadeh u'b'cherem ve'lo nishteh mei be'er. We're not going to take anything from you. Rather, derech hamelech nelech. Lo niteh yamin u'smol ad asher na'avor gevulecha. We're basically going to continue north along King's Highway. We won't ask you for anything. We just want passage. And if we continue along these stories, we move all the way up King's Highway to Nachal Arnon. And that's when we eventually conquer Sichon and Og Melech HaAmori, and finally we move back south and cross the Jordan into Yericho. So we're moving along the King's Highway. The next route, which is north to south, is what's called Kvish HaBik'ah. It's the Jordan Valley. That's Highway 90 of today. You can get there basically from the Dead Sea all the way up to the Kinneret, and then you can continue east going to the Golan Heights, or west to Emek Yisrael. And the main highway in the land is called Derech Hahar, or the hill. It's Highway 60 of today. It basically goes from Beersheba all the way up to Shechem. Now, this is not much of an international route because it's between the hills. It's very vulnerable. It's not so convenient to travel with an army, especially with chariots, so it's only used in battles and in certain situations. But other than that, it's really for local travel. Most of the stories of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and they are happening between Shechem and between Beersheba. Let's look at the first time Avraham Avinu comes into Israel. Vayavor Avram ba'aretz ad mekom Shechem ad Elon Moreh, va'knani az ba'aretz. Avraham Avinu continues, and he goes between Bet-El and Ha'ai, Bet-El miyam v'Ha'ai mikedem, va'even shem mizbeach la'Hashem. That's Bet-El. Yaakov Avinu also goes to Bet-El, has his dream, and then continues up north, right? He comes back into Eretz Yisrael through the Abok and goes straight to Shechem. The most important route to the west is called by the Romans Via Maris, the Derech Hayam, the way of the sea. That is the main highway coming from Egypt into the ancient Near East, into Mesopotamia. And this is the most important connection, because here is where we have some of the most famous battles in history happening, and some of the earliest recorded battles in history are happening along this route here in Israel, in the most important way that connects between Egypt to the Middle East, and that is Emek Yisrael, the Jezreel Valley. When you continue along the coastline, you have two options. You can either continue up straight, what's known as Sulama Shel Tzor, the ladder of Tyre, which basically goes through Tzor, Tzidon. You're going basically along the coast of Lebanon, but that's going to take you northwest. If you want to go northeast, you have to take a right around the area of Nachal Kishon, which is a very important battleground. You can say it is the battleground where some of the major battles, not only in history, but throughout Tanakh, happen in Eretz Yisrael. This area is protected by three fortress cities. You have Yokneam, Megiddo, and Ta'anach. Yokneam, Megiddo, and Ta'anach are the three cities that protect the passageway from Egypt to Mesopotamia. And this is why it's such an important battleground. Perhaps the earliest recorded battle in history, from about 3,480 years ago, is the Battle of Thutmose III. You may have heard of his predecessor, Queen Hatshepsut, who called herself a pharaoh. This is Thutmose III. Now, Thutmose III came into Israel on a campaign to suppress a revolt of the Canaanim, of the Canaanites, and he recorded this battle in his temple in Luxor, and he talks about the Battle of Megiddo. What he did in this particular point is he did the counterintuitive thing. The intuitive thing would be, if you're going to go north, you're obviously not going to continue north through the Carmel because it's just the wrong direction, and it's also a very dangerous place to pass. And the whole area of Nachal Kishon, where Dvorah and Barak defeat Sisra because of the muddy terrain, which is not really favorable for chariots and wheels, right? That's the natural way you would assume you go because it just has more breadth. They don't go that way. Instead, he goes through a narrow pass called Yiron, or Vadi Ara, and in that wadi there are some places where you can really only walk one person behind the other. In other words, you are very vulnerable. Now, the Canaanites assumed that Thutmose III is smarter than that. He's not going to endanger his entire army, and he's going to come through Nachal Kishon. He's going to come the regular way, passing somewhere near Ta'anach, near Yokneam, Megiddo, like he'll be out in the open. And they were waiting for him there, except he surprised them and went around through the long and dangerous way through Wadi Ara and surprised them and defeated them. And this is the first recorded battle in history happening right here in the Emek Israel in the Jezreel Valley. Now, this battle was recorded on a temple in Karnak, which we only learned how to decipher and to read about 150 years ago. That translation was carried around by Sir Edmund Allenby, who defeated the Ottoman Empire in the Battle of Megiddo and thus was given the title Sir Allenby of Megiddo. This is where he actually followed in the footsteps of Thutmose III because he read this book, and it's a great story about how he had access to the book, which was just hot off the press. And he followed those footsteps, and that really began what we know as the British Mandate. So that's a critical battle that happened there. A devastating battle that took place in this exact place is what's known as the Battle of Megiddo with Yoshiyahu, where Yoshiyahu attempted to block the passage of Paro Necho, who was going north to get to a place called Carchemish, to battle against the Babylonians, to join the Assyrians, who are their enemy, but the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And they wanted to join Assyria against Bavel, against Babylon, and they lost in this battle. Yoshiyahu is killed for the sole reason that he blocked Paro Necho from moving up north along this route. And why did he stop him in Megiddo? Because in the coast, Paro has all the advantage. He has chariots, he has a massive army. But here in this area, you are at the mercy of whoever's in the fortified cities, which is why he thought he had the upper ground. And of course, he also thought he had the upper moral ground, which is why he went out to fight him in the first place. And we'll get to that hopefully in the end. So these are the main highways of north to south that really dictate how you travel, how you move around. Now let's talk about the east to west. Now, in order to understand the east to west, which basically divides the country into three main sections, which is basically Yehuda in the south, we sort of have Ephraim sort of in the middle, and then in the north we have the Galil. That division into three is dictated by ancient history. We're talking about geologic history, in which what we have now used to be the Western Syrian African continent, which eventually settled down, giving us the Syrian African Rift in what's more or less the Jordan Valley, and creating these three main east to west lines. So from north to south, we first of all have the Yarmukh, which passes by En Harod and Nachal Kishon, so that's the Jezreel Valley. So that's the Yarmukh, which is one of the tributaries of the Jordan. So that's the first one. The second one, which Yaakov Avinu uses to enter Eretz Yisrael, is sort of like in between the Kinneret and Yam HaMelech. That's called the Yabok. Yaakov Avinu crosses the Yabok. That's where he splits his camp and he goes and he fights off the Malach, calls the place Penuel, and then moves into a place called Sukkot, and then he goes to Shechem. So it's basically in the footsteps of Avraham Avinu. That goes Yabok, Nachal Farah, Nachal HaKaneh. That's how it moves east to west. The third one, which runs south of Jerusalem by the Kidron Valley, is actually Nachal Arnon. Nachal Arnon, which we cross, we sing about. We were almost destroyed there, as Chazal tell us. There was an ambush waiting for us there. It's a very impressive pass when you see it from Jordan. And it's one of those very powerful barriers that you need to cross when you move north. And we crossed north of the Arnon and eventually entered from Yericho. So Arnon continues to the Kidron Valley. If you drive up Highway 90, the Jordan Valley, you'll actually see that it says Nachal Kidron to your left, and you're like, I thought Kidron is under Jerusalem, but it actually moves east and west. It goes all the way to the Jordan Valley. And that continues into Nachal Sorek, which is basically along the lines of today's Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, Ayalon, Highway 1, or to Modi'in, Highway 443, which we're going to get to soon. So these are the main three routes. Now, there's very important battles that happened along these routes, and I'd like to give a few examples to connect that. Now, the Plishtim, they control the coast, Ashdod, Ekron, Gat, Aza, Ashkelon. Every point of conflict between the Plishtim and Am Yisrael, there's somewhere along these ways in which you can connect and come into the country along these routes. The northern one, of course, is around the place called Dor today, and between Dor and the Gilboa Hills, we have Emek Israel, the Jezreel Valley. That's where Shaul fights his last battle, in which he and his son Yonatan are killed. The second east to west dividing line is Tel Afek. Now, if you stand at Tel Afek, you realize that you can't get crossed just by jumping past it. Like, this is a serious crossing point, and that's why the point of Tel Afek is such an important place. If you go there today, to the National Park of Tel Afek, there's a fortress there with the story. It's a very important place where battles have been fought, won, or lost, depending whose side you're on. And at this point, of course, we have the battle where we lost against Plishtim, and the Aron was taken into the coast, into the Plishtim. It goes to Ekron, and then it sort of makes its rounds. Where does the Aron end up? It ends up coming into Beit Shemesh. Why Beit Shemesh? Because Beit Shemesh is the closest entry point from Ashdod or Ashkelon into the hill, into the Har, where we are living, whereas the Plishtim are in the coast. And it's in this place where the Plishtim basically send off the Aron into the first Jewish city right there, and that is Beit Shemesh. And then it goes in from there, and it slowly makes its way to Yerushalayim. Now, another very important battle that happened with the Plishtim, we're going backwards in time, is of course the battle of David and Goliath. The battle of David and Goliath is happening right near Beit Shemesh, between Socho and Azekah, and we're going to talk about Azekah soon, in a place called Efes Damim, which can be understood as either a no man's land or a tax-free zone, but you're right there in between the coast, the Shfela, and the Har. So we're on the Har, they're in the Shfela, and the battle is happening at one of those entry points, Azekah, which is one of the most powerful fortresses defending the entry from the Via Maris into the land of Yehuda. And this is where David fights his battle against Goliath, and after that battle is won, we find the Plishtim running away between Socho and Azekah and Sha'araim until they come to the gates of Ekron. So that's that direction, and we understand why that battle is happening in specifically that location. The next entry point is the third one, which connects to Kidron, of course, as I mentioned, is Ayalon, Highway 1 or 443. Either way, you know that it's an odd number, so it's east to west. That takes us to the story which is the namesake of the Ayalon Highway, which today is notorious for its traffic, but it used to be notorious for stones that might come falling on you from the sky. And that takes us to the very famous battle where Yoshua is coming to defend the Givonim, who became our allies, fighting against the kings of the south, Makedah and Dvir and the such. And the battle takes place right here on Highway 443. We're going east to west. We're going from the area of Yerushalayim and we're going westward. So Yoshua gathers his forces and pursues the kings. Vayavo elehem Yoshua pitom kol halayla ala min hagilgal. He's coming from the southeast. Vayehumem Hashem lifnei Yisrael vayakem makah gdola begivon near Yerushalayim. Vayirdefem derech ma'ale bet choron, Highway 443. Vayakem ad Azekah. He's moving in the general area of Beit Shemesh ve'ad Makedah. Vayihi benusam mipnei Yisrael hem bemorad bet choron. Here they are. V'Hashem ishlich alem avanim gdolot min hashamayim ad Azekah vayamutu. And while this happens, Yoshua says, well, listen, the party's just getting started. Let's let this go on for a little bit longer. Az yedaber Yoshua laHashem biyom tet Hashem et ha'emori lifnei bnei Yisrael vayomer le'enei Yisrael shemesh begiv'on dom ve'yareach be'emek Ayalon. Ayalon Valley, that is basically 443 near Beit Choron. Now, this highway is so important because we talk about Israel's independence. We just came from Yom HaAtzmaut and Yom Yerushalayim, and the critical thing which basically defined the before and after those 19 years between 1948 and 1967 is that Highway 1 was blocked off. There was no access from the west to the east. You could not get into Jerusalem. That's why when you come into Jerusalem today, on Highway 1, you pass Latrun and you see the convoys which were destroyed, the armored vehicles that tried to make their way into the besieged Jerusalem. There's the Burma Road that tried to break a way in to bring supplies and ammunition to the people fighting in Jerusalem. That critical entry point from the coast into Yerushalayim is, of course, the namesake of the Jaffa Gate, which has the main route that goes out to Jaffa, to one of the most ancient ports in Israel, which is thousands of years old. We know it from the story of Yonah running away to Tarshish. We know it from the story of Hiram sending shipments to Shlomo HaMelech to help build the Beit HaMikdash. So Jaffa has been an active port. We also know it from a story of Yehuda Maccabi. And the pivotal battle that showed Yehuda Maccabi to be not only a guerrilla fighter, but also a tactician and a very smart warrior. and a very savvy commander is the Battle of Emmaus, the Battle of Latrun. And what Yehuda Maccabi did there, kind of similar to what Yoshua did to Ha'ai, is he fooled them into leaving their camps, attacked them while they came to attack him, and by the time they realized they're not there, the Greeks turned around and found that their base camp is all up in flames, and while they turned around to find their attackers, the sun was rising from the east, blinding them, using that to the advantage of Yehuda Maccabi. Now, this is just one of the many battles that were fought in this area, but even the battles of the Maccabees can be understood with this terrain. Like the first battles of the Maccabees are Highway 60, or the second one is Beit Horon. It's exactly following Highway 60 and Highway 443. So these routes really dictate the way the battles are going to be carried out. I'd like to take us now to the last standing fortified cities in the kingdom of Yehuda before its fall, and those are Lachish and Azekah. As the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar are surrounding the kingdom, Jerusalem is under siege. We hear Yirmiyahu speaking to Tzidkiyahu. וידבר ירמיהו הנביא אל צדקיהו מלך יהודה את כל הדברים האלה בירושלים. He's trying to encourage him. He's trying to tell him that you can surrender to Nebuchadnezzar and you will be saved, but he will not listen. וחיל מלך בבל נלחמים על ירושלים ועל כל ערי יהודה הנותרות אל לכיש ואל עזקה כי הנה נשארו בערי יהודה ערי מבצר. All of the cities of the kingdom of Yehuda are falling, and the army of Babylon are besieging Lachish and Azekah, because those are the last standing fortified cities. And once they fall, Yerushalayim will fall next. Once we understand the terrain, you can understand why Lachish and Azekah are so important, and why they're the last ones to actually fall before Yerushalayim, because they are protecting the entryway into Yerushalayim. And here's where I'd like to wrap things up. With this overview of the crisscrossing network of highways that are pretty much governed by the terrain, by ancient rivers, by hills, by the most convenient way, the safest way to pass through the country, we can look at Tanakh differently. We can understand why the battles unfolded the way that they did. What is the advantage of Dvorah and Barak fighting out a battle in Nachal Kishon, and why that's the place where Sisera would fall. We can also understand why the destruction of the kingdom of Israel, or the kingdom of Yehuda, happens in the way that it did, and why Yerushalayim falls after all the coastal cities around have to fall first. It's not only that you're controlling the easy way in, you're also making sure that you're not going to be ambushed from the back. You're gradually making your way into the country. And this even helps us understand some surprising things. Because there's a question. There's a famous chazal that talks about Rachel mevaka al banah, min'i kolech mibechi ve'inayim midim'ah. And chazal say that Rachel is weeping for her children. This is specifically Malchut Yisrael, as we are going out into Galut. And the simple question arises is like, if Rachel is actually buried in Derech Beit Lechem, which is south of Yehuda, and the kingdom of Israel is deported from the Shomron, which is north, how could we have possibly passed by Kever Rachel? Now there's two different opinions as to where Kever Rachel is. You can say that it's in Binyamin, near Adam of today, Gvul Binyamin Betzel Tzach, which is the famous story of Shaul receiving Nevuah for the first time on his way home after hearing from Shmuel that he's going to be the king. But the other explanation, which is roughly where we understand Kever Rachel to be today, has to do with the lay of the land. If you are coming in and destroying the kingdom, you're coming through the hills, it's a lot easier, instead of reversing and going back through the hills, which is very difficult to navigate and very dangerous, it's a lot easier to go a little further south, to move west, to cross the Jordan, and then to go up through the King's Highway. And once you go up the King's Highway, it's a lot faster and easier, and this is a route that was known to be taken by the Assyrian kings, which is why this midrash can also fit when we understand the lay of the land and the terrain. And I want to end with the story of Yoshiyahu. Why was Yoshiyahu killed? Yoshiyahu was killed because he didn't listen to Yirmiyahu Hanavi. Yirmiyahu Hanavi was telling him, you're not on the high level that you think you are. And the brachot, which we just read in Parashat Bechukotai, right before this recording was done at least, is V'cherev lo ta'avor be'artzechem. A sword shall not pass through your land. And he thought that we were on such a level that a cherev shall not even pass through, as the Sifra says and Chazal say, even if it's in times of peace, as Paro says to Yeshayahu, "Ma li valach ki bata lelechem alai." Like, I have no quarrel with you. Let me pass. Right? He had some quarrel with somebody up north. And yet, the Torah tells us that when we are acting properly, the blessing is that in such situations, a sword will not even pass through our country. But perhaps we can take this a step further and say, "V'cherev lo ta'avor ba'artzachem." If we do things the way they should be done, there won't be need for any cherev to pass through our land, because finally the nevuah of Yeshayahu will come true. Lo yisa goy el goy cherev v'lo yilmedu od milchama.